step into the shadows of history, where secrets, scandals, and forbidden stories come alive. In the comments below, tell us, which city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Let's see where our viewers around the world are tuning in from as we uncover the darkest corners of the past. The governor did not call it cruelty, he called it recreation. In the circles where he moved among officers, landowners, visiting officials from across the water boredom was considered a greater sin than brutality. Power, once secured, demanded novelty. And the governor had grown tired of cards of drink, of women who laughed too carefully and men who agreed too quickly. He wanted something that reminded him he was still feared. The idea came to him one afternoon while watching the fields from the veranda, shaded and cool while the land below baked under the sun. Rows of enslaved bodies moved in slow, grinding rhythm, cutting, lifting, hauling. Among them, one man stood apart, not because he worked harder, but because he was impossible to ignore. He was large, not merely tall but broad, thick through the chest and hips, his body carrying weight that did not come from leisure but from years of forced feeding and unrelenting labor. The governor had ordered it so. A well-fed slave lasted longer. A well-fed slave impressed visitors. They called the man fat. When they spoke of him, though the word was said with laughter, as if his size were a joke rather than an artifact of control. They laughed because they believed slowness lived inside flesh like his. They laughed because it was easier than admitting the truth that such a body was built to endure. The governor leaned forward, watching the man bend and rise again, sweat soaking into cloth stretched tight across his back. A smile crept across the governor, his face thin and deliberate. He turned to the man beside him, a captain visiting from another district, and said lightly, "That one would make a fine chase." The captain followed his gaze and chuckled. "Too big to run far," he said. He dropped before the dogs even warmed up. "Perhaps," the governor replied, "but I'd like to see it." The word settled between them, heavy and unmistakable. By evening, the idea had spread. By nightfall, it had become an event. They announced it the next day as if it were a favor. The enslaved were gathered, forced into rows beneath the sun. The governor stood above them, dressed impeccably, voice carrying easily. He spoke of discipline, of order, of the need to remind property of its place. Then he smiled, the way a man smiled when he believed himself generous. "To show mercy," he said, "I will allow one among you a chance, a hunt. If he runs well enough, perhaps he earns a longer life." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, fear, confusion, disbelief. The governor, his eyes scanned them lazily before settling on the large man. He gestured with a gloved hand. That one hand seized the man immediately, rough, practiced. He was pulled forward, chains clanking, feet dragging lines through the dust. Up close, the governor studied him openly, circling once like a buyer inspecting stock. He poked at the man's arm, at his stomach, amused by the solidity beneath skin. "All this meat," the governor said to the gathered guests, and no idea what to do with it. Laughter followed. Bets were placed before the man was even led away. The enslaved man said nothing. Silence had long ago become a habit, then a weapon. He kept his eyes lowered, not in submission but in calculation. He listened. He watched shadows. He felt the direction of the wind on his skin, the heat of the ground through his bare feet. Every detail mattered now. They kept him confined for 2 nights before the hunt, not out of mercy but anticipation. Food was delivered in excess: thick porridge, bread, meat, salted heavy. Fuel, one overseer joked. Would want him collapsing too soon. The man ate slowly, deliberately, conserving strength. His body knew hunger, but it also knew preparation. On the morning of the hunt, the estate transformed. Horses were saddled. Dogs were brought in from neighboring lands, lean, vicious animals trained to track and tear. Rifles were cleaned. Guests arrived dressed for sport, laughing as if attending a festival. The governor presided over it all with visible satisfaction, issuing instructions like a conductor arranging music. They brought the man out last. He was stripped to trousers, wrists bound loosely enough to allow movement but tight enough to remind him of ownership. Someone smeared animal blood across his shoulder and chest, a crude attempt to excite the dogs. The crowd laughed openly now, mocking his size, shouting encouragement meant only to humiliate. "Run hard," someone called. "Try not to shake the ground too much," another added. The governor raised a hand for silence. He stepped close to the man, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "Do make it interesting," he said. "I've grown tired of easy things. Then, with theatrical flourish, the governor gestured toward the forest beyond the fields, a vast stretch of trees, uneven ground, swamp and thicket. "You have a head start," he announced. "Use it wisely." The ropes were cut. For a heartbeat, the man did not move. The crowd leaned forward, breath held, expecting panic, stumbling spectacle. Then he turned and began to walk, not run, but walk toward the tree line. Laughter erupted behind him. "He doesn't even understand," someone shouted. But the man understood perfectly. He crossed into the shade of the forest just as the governor counted aloud. At 10, the dogs were released. At 20, the first riders spurred forward. At 30, the hunt was underway, loud and confident. Inside the forest, the man slowed only once he was beyond sight. He bent, pressing his palm into the soil, feeling its dampness, its gift. He inhaled deeply, the smell of earth, rot, water, leaf. He had worked this land for years. He knew where it betrayed and where it protected. He knew which paths looked easy but swallowed the unwary. He moved then not in a straight line, not in panic, but with intent. He brushed against trees deliberately, confusing scent. He doubled back through shallow water, masking his trail. His breath stayed steady despite his size, lungs expanding fully, efficiently. His body, mocked for its weight, carried him forward without complaint. Behind him, horns sounded. Dogs bayed. The sound of men laughing drifted through the trees. They believed the ending was already written. They did not yet understand that the hunt had chosen the wrong animal. By the time the governor reached the forest edge, horse prancing impatiently beneath him, the man they had mocked was already gone, swallowed not by fear, but by strategy. And the game, once begun, could not be called back. This was only the opening move. They did not let the morning end with the release alone. A governor who staged a hunt for sport understood something about spectacle. The chase was only half the pleasure. The other half was the humiliation that came before it, the slow stripping away of a man as personhood while an audience laughed, because laughter made cruelty feel communal and therefore safe. So after the first release, after the dogs, baying had begun to fade deeper into the trees, and the riders had thundered out in confident pursuit. The governor did not simply sit back and wait for news. He turned the estate into a theater. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the people he invited, captains, merchants, planters, sons with soft hands. He wanted them to feel like they belonged to something powerful, something sacred in its ugliness. Men like that did not want to think of themselves as monsters. They wanted to think of themselves as tradition. They gathered on the lawn near the main house where the land dipped toward the fields. Chairs were set beneath awnings. Drinks were poured into glasses that caught sunlight like small mirrors. The governor's wife did not attend, nor did the women of the household. They were told the sport was not for delicate ears. But servants, enslaved servants, were made to stand nearby and watch because fear was part of the lesson. A few minutes into the chase, one of the guests asked lightly, "Will he last long?" The governor smiled, as if being asked about the weather. "Long enough," he said. Then he added, amused, "I've kept him fed for a reason." They laughed at that because it was framed like a joke and because everyone understood the truth beneath it. The man's weight had never been his own. Even his flesh had been managed. He had been fed not as a kindness, but as a calculation, as one might fatten an animal before slaughter or before exhibition. His body had been curated for this moment. The governor raised his glass toward the tree line where distant shouts echoed faintly now and then. "To a fine run," he said. They drank. Then they began to talk about the man the way men talked about horses, his strength, his gait, whether his lungs would fail. And as they spoke, they shaped him into an object again, remaking him in their mouths. Not a man running for his life, but a piece of entertainment moving through scenery. To deepen the show, the governor sent overseers into the slave quarters with orders. Enslaved people were herded forward again and forced to stand along the edge of the field, facing the forest. They were made to be audience too. The governor wanted them to hear the laughter. He wanted them to understand that even escape could be turned into sport, that even desperation could be owned. A boy barely old enough to carry a sack began to cry quietly. An overseer struck him across the shoulders without looking, the motion casual, practiced. The boy swallowed the sound and stared ahead, shaking. Around him, faces remained still, eyes lowered. Stillness was survival. Stillness was the only form of defiance that did not immediately invite death. The governor watched the line of enslaved faces with satisfaction. He enjoyed the way fear traveled. Fear was a chain that reached farther than iron. The horns sounded again, closer now, and a cheer went up among the guests. Someone shouted that the dogs had caught the scent. Another swore he could hear the captive crashing through brush. They laughed again. They wanted it to be clumsy. They wanted him to be exactly what they had called him, slow, stupid, doomed. But then a runner came back from the tree line, breathless, mud-splattered. One of the younger riders had been thrown. Nothing serious. The man insisted quickly, as if afraid of being mocked for weakness. But the horse had panicked, spooked by something unseen in the undergrowth, and the rider had taken a hard fall. The governor smiled tightened. "Horses spook," he said, dismissive. "The woods are full of nonsense." Yet his eyes flicked briefly toward the forest, and something like irritation passed over his face. He did not like interruptions. He did not like the hunt asserting its own unpredictability. He signaled for more drink and instructed the riders to press harder. More men mounted. More dogs were loosed. The hunt swelled, its noise thickening as if volume could guarantee victory. Within the forest, the enslaved man moved in a way that did not match their fantasies. His body did not crash blindly. It slid. It chose. He knew how to place his weight so branches bent rather than snapped. He knew where mud could hold him without swallowing him. He was heavy, yes, heavy with muscle, and the forced fullness of a life managed by others, but he had spent years hauling, lifting, enduring. Endurance lived in him like bone. He reached a stretch of low ground where water pooled beneath a canopy of cypress. He waded through without hesitation, letting cold water climb his legs, soaking his trousers, pulling heat from his skin. He moved to a patch where the water ran shallow and clear over hard stone, scrubbing away scent. When he reached the far side, he pressed himself against a tree and listened. Dogs. Close, men shouting. The rhythm of hooves. He could have kept running. Running was what they expected. Running was what they had designed the game around. But he had learned something about men like these. They loved the idea of control more than control itself. They loved a chase because it made them feel active, righteous. If he ran in the direction they assumed, he would be forced to keep running until his body failed. So he changed the story. He stepped into a cluster of reeds and crouched low, submerging himself to the waist. The water smelled of old leaves and life decaying slowly. Mosquitoes whined near his ears. He did not swat them. Movement betrayed. He inhaled through his nose, slow and deep, and let his mind settle into the old disciplined breath count, stillness. The world narrowed to sound. The dogs arrived first, splashing, baying, circling the water, edge confused. Their noses worked frantically, but water dulled certainty. One dog stepped closer, sniffing, whining, then backed away as if something in the swamp repelled it. Another dog growled low, hackles rising, then turned abruptly and ran back toward its handler. Not from disobedience, these were trained animals, but from instinct. The enslaved man watched them through reeds, eyes steady. He did not think of it as magic, he did not name it. But he could feel the swamp around him like a living thing. He had been born into a world where the church of the oppressor called his ancestors, practices devilry while using the Bible to justify bondage. He had grown up hearing whispers, how certain roots could calm fever, how certain words said under breath could harden the heart against fear, how a person could carry the dead with them like armor. These whispers were never complete, never safe to speak openly, but they existed. They survived because survival required more than muscle. The men arrived behind the dogs, shouting angry at the animals' confusion. They got him, one rider hollered. Dogs got him. But the dogs had not gotten anything. They circled, uncertain. The riders dismounted and moved into the wet ground, cursing as mud pulled at boots. "He is in here," someone insisted. The enslaved man remained still enough that the mosquitoes landed on his cheek and drank. He did not flinch. He watched the riders spread. He watched how they moved, wide stances, weapons held high to keep them from water. They were confident but not careful. They relied on sound and panic. They did not understand stillness. A rider stepped onto a patch of mud that looked solid but was not. His foot sank suddenly up to the shin. He yelped, startled, and the moment he bent to free himself, his rifle slipped from his shoulder and splashed into water. The man cursed, lunging to grab it, and sank deeper. Laughter rose behind him from another rider, quick, cruel laughter until that rider slipped too. And then no one laughed. The enslaved man used that moment to move not forward but sideways, gliding through reeds, letting the water cover his motion. He reached the base of a tree where the roots rose like knuckles above the swamp. He took a slow breath, then another, and placed his hand on the root. He felt the vibration of footsteps. He felt their impatience. A dog splashed close again, snout dipping toward the water, and for a moment it seemed the animal might find him after all. The enslaved man did not move. He fixed his gaze on the dog's eyes and held it there, steady and unblinking. The dog's whine faltered. It backed away again, head low, tail tucked. It turned and fled the reeds, splashing hard, as if pursued. One handler swore and yanked the dog back by its collar, striking it. The dog yelped, then refused to move forward again, nails digging into mud. The handler's face tightened with frustration, and he spat into the swamp. They were losing time. Time mattered. The head start was supposed to be a joke. The governor's entire narrative depended on the captive being caught quickly enough to keep laughter alive. If the captive lasted too long, the mood would change. If the captive made the hunt difficult, the governor would be embarrassed, and embarrassment was dangerous. Embarrassed men became crueler. The enslaved man understood this without being told. When the riders withdrew from the swamp, dragging their muddied boots and cursing their dogs for cowardice, he remained submerged for several more minutes, listening until the sound of hooves faded. Then he rose slowly, water streaming from his clothes, and moved deeper into the trees. He did not go far before he found what he needed, a fallen branch, long and heavy, its end broken into a jagged point. He dragged it into a thicket where leaves and vines would hide it. He found another branch and snapped it into shorter lengths. His hands moved with the familiarity of labor. He had built fences, repaired carts, dug ditches. Building was not foreign to him. Now he built for a different purpose. He selected a narrow path where riders would likely press through, eager to recover lost time. He pressed sharpened sticks into the earth at an angle, low enough to catch a boot or a horse's leg, high enough to pierce flesh. He covered them with leaves carefully, blending them into the ground. He made a second trap farther ahead, a simple snare line stretched between two trees at shin height, meant to topple a rushing man. These were not elaborate. They did not need to be. They only needed to disrupt confidence. As he worked, he heard distant horns again. The sound sharper now, irritated rather than celebratory. The hunt was tightening. The governor, as men were pushing deeper and faster, their voices less amused. Back on the estate lawn, the governor's guests had begun to shift in their seats. Subtle but real. Men like him lived on perception. If this became a story about a governor who could not even stage a proper hunt, it would travel. It would stain him. It would invite whispers in rooms where power mattered. So he sent more riders, more dogs. He ordered the handlers to beat the animals if they hesitated. He instructed them to shoot if the captive turned violent. Violent, as if violence were not the foundation of every breath on his estate. The enslaved man moved again, faster now, angling toward higher ground where the soil hardened. His soaked trousers clung to his legs, heavy, but he welcomed the weight. Weight was not weakness. Weight was momentum. He breathed steadily, letting his heart work without panic. Then he heard it closer than before. A horse. 2 horses. Riders pushing through brush, forcing speed where the land resisted. Their impatience made them loud. Their confidence made them blind. He slipped into position beside the path he had prepared and crouched low behind a tree. His hands gripped the heavy branch he had sharpened, knuckles tight. He did not think of himself as prey anymore. Prey ran until it collapsed. He was done collapsing. The first horse came through at a trot that was too fast for uneven ground. The rider leaned forward, scanning, weapon ready. The horse's front leg struck the concealed angled stake and buckled. The animal screamed a horrible sound and went down hard, throwing the rider forward. The rider hit the ground with a violent crack, breath knocked out of him. The second rider shouted, pulling his horse up too sharply. The horse reared, hooves churning air. The rider fought for control, wide-eyed with sudden fear. That was the moment. The enslaved man surged from behind the tree, moving with shocking speed for a body they had mocked as slow. He swung the heavy branch down hard, striking the second rider, shoulder, not to kill but to break. The rider screamed, dropping his weapon. The horse bolted, panicked, dragging the rider half hanging from the saddle before the man fell into brush. The enslaved man stepped back into shadow immediately, disappearing before the rider could fully comprehend what had happened. His chest rose and fell, powerful and controlled. His hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the shock of action after days of enforced stillness. He listened. He heard distant shouting begin to swell, men calling to one another, alarm spreading. The hunt had changed. What had been a sport was becoming something else, something the governor had not planned for, a contest where the captive was not merely running, but shaping the pursuit. And the governor, sitting under his awning, glass in hand, jaw tightening, felt it too, even before the messengers arrived with news. His fattest slave was not entertaining them anymore. He was answering them. The hunt did not slow after the first injury. It splintered. Men who had ridden in loose formation now clustered in tight knots, voices sharp, overlapping, each trying to reassert control with volume. Orders contradicted each other. Dogs pulled against leashes, agitated, confused by broken scent and the metallic tang of blood that did not belong where it should have. The forest, once a backdrop for sport, asserted itself as terrain uneven, resistant, unwilling. The governor received the first report while still seated beneath the awning. A rider approached at speed, horse lathered, eyes rolling. The man slid down clumsily, favoring one side, and spoke too quickly, words tumbling over each other. A horse down, a rider hurt. The captive had struck from cover. Laughter faltered, glasses paused halfway to mouths. Struck how? The governor asked, voice calm, almost bored. With a branch, the rider said. Like he was waiting. The governor waved a dismissive hand. Then stop riding like fools. Press him harder. But something in the rider, his face lingered, something that did not match the explanation. Not shock, not pain, something closer to disbelief. Out in the forest, the enslaved man moved again, deeper now, choosing ground that forced decisions. He no longer doubled back randomly. He guided the pursuit the way water guided careless feet toward deeper channels. He listened constantly, building a picture of the hunt without seeing it, how many riders were near, how close the dogs, how confident the men sounded. Confidence was thinning. He reached a rise where the forest opened briefly, offering a view of tangled branches and distant movement. He crouched and watched riders push through a narrow pass between two heavy oaks. It was the kind of place men chose because it looked efficient, because it felt like progress. He had learned long ago that efficiency was often a lie. He pulled a length of vine tight between the trunks at chest height and layered leaves lightly over it, just enough to break the line of sight. He stepped back and waited. The next rider came through at speed, leaning forward, eyes fixed ahead. The vine caught him cleanly, snapping tight across his chest and throat. He flew backward from the saddle, landing hard, breath torn from his lungs. His horse bolted, riderless, crashing through brush. The enslaved man did not linger. He moved sideways again, letting the forest swallow him. Shouts erupted behind him, alarm, anger, the sharp edge of fear. Men rushed to help the fallen rider. Others pressed on, desperate to prove something to themselves. The dogs were loosed again, beaten forward when they hesitated. Their baying cut through the trees, uneven and frantic now. They picked up the trail briefly, then lost it again near another stretch of water. One handler slipped and fell, dragging a dog down with him. The animal snarled, panicked, snapping at the man's arm. The handler screamed, blood mixing with mud. The enslaved man heard it all. He felt no satisfaction, no thrill. What he felt was focus, a narrowing of the world to motion and breath and timing. He had crossed the line where fear ruled him. Now fear worked for him. He paused at the edge of a clearing where sunlight filtered down in pale shafts. His chest heaved. Sweat ran freely now, streaking mud across his skin. He pressed his back to a tree and closed his eyes briefly, grounding himself. He thought of the fields, of endless days measured in pain and repetition, of being fed, fattened, evaluated like an object. They had mistaken size for softness. They had never understood what endurance did to a body over years. His weight did not slow him, it anchored him. Each step landed solidly sure. When he ran with purpose, not panic. A gunshot cracked somewhere to his left. Then another. They were firing blindly now, hoping noise might substitute for control. Bullets tore into bark and leaves, useless. He moved away from the sound, angling uphill, forcing them to follow. One rider pushed ahead of the others, anger driving him faster than caution. The man burst through brush and into a shallow gully, not seeing the pit until it gave way beneath his weight. He fell hard, leg twisting with a sickening snap. The scream that followed was raw, immediate. The enslaved man stood above the gully a moment later, looking down. The rider clawed at the sides, trying to pull himself free, eyes wide with terror. He looked up and saw the man he had been hunting. "Wait," the rider gasped. "Wait, please." The enslaved man did not respond. He reached down and took the rider's dropped pistol, weighing it in his hand. He had seen guns his entire life. He had felt their threat without ever being allowed their power. He did not raise it. He did not need to. He stepped back and covered the pit with more brush, not enough to hide it, just enough to make escape harder. He turned and left the riders screaming behind him, the sound carrying briefly before the forest absorbed it. By now, the hunt had lost all pretense of sport. Orders were barked, then ignored. Riders dismounted, arguing whether to continue on foot. Dogs cowered, refusing to advance into certain thickets. One handler struck a dog so hard it whimpered and fled. The governor received another report, this one delivered by a man with blood on his sleeve and mud streaked up his coat. 2 riders down, dogs refusing scent, traps found deliberate. The governor stood this time, irritation flaring into something sharper. "He is one man," he snapped. "One, you or letting a single slave make you fools." The men around him shifted uncomfortably. No one laughed now. "What if he reaches the ravine?" Someone asked quietly. The governor, his jaw tightened. He knew the ravine steep, choked with rock and water, dangerous even for men who respected it. He had avoided it intentionally when planning the hunt, trusting the captive would run elsewhere. "Cut him off," the governor ordered. "Bring him down. End this." More guns were brought forward. Ammunition was distributed. The language changed. Where once they had spoken of sport, now they spoke of threat. In the forest, the enslaved man felt the shift before he heard it. The rhythm of pursuit changed. Fewer shouts, more deliberate movement. The sound of metal being handled carefully. They were done playing. He adjusted immediately. He avoided open ground. He moved lower, slower, using trees as shields. When he heard a rider ahead, he stopped and let the man pass within arm's reach, unseen. When he heard 2 sets of footsteps behind him, he doubled back through brush so thick it tore at his skin, trusting pain over exposure. A bullet grazed his shoulder, hot and shocking. He hissed, clamping a hand over the wound, then forced himself to keep moving. Blood could betray him if he let it. He tore a strip from his trousers and bound the shoulder tightly, teeth clenched. Pain sharpened him further. He reached the ravine as the sun began to dip, shadows lengthening. The drop was steep, water rushing loud enough to mask sound. Rock slick with moss jutted at dangerous angles. He descended carefully, using roots and stone, letting gravity work with him rather than against him. Behind him, raiders skidded to a halt at the edge, cursing. One dismounted and peered down, eyes widening. "He went down there," the man said, incredulous. "He'll kill himself." The governor arrived moments later, breath tight, face flushed. He looked into the ravine, then back at the men. "Then he saves us the trouble," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But the enslaved man did not die. He moved through the ravine like someone who had hauled weight up and down worse slopes his entire life. He slipped once, skinning his palm raw, but caught himself. He waded through cold water, letting it numb his legs, washing away blood and scent. He climbed the far side slowly, choosing handholds with care. When he reached the top, he did not run. He turned. The ravine forced the hunters into a narrow descent if they followed, one at a time, careful, vulnerable. He waited in shadow, breathing slow, heart pounding steady. The first man came down cautiously, rifle slung, boots slipping. The enslaved man surged forward and struck hard with a rock, crushing the man's shoulder. The rifle clattered into the ravine. The man screamed, fell backward, vanished into the rush of water below. The second hunter froze at the edge, staring down in horror. The enslaved man stepped into view, chest heaving, eyes dark and unflinching. For the first time, the hunter truly saw him not as property, not as spectacle, but as a man who had decided not to die quietly. The hunter backed away, hands raised, stumbling. "This ain't tea right," he muttered. "This ain't tea." The enslaved man advanced one step. That was enough. The hunter turned and ran, scrambling back toward the others, shouting incoherently. Panic rippled outward, infecting those who heard it. The governor watched the retreat from a distance, disbelief curdling into rage. He had wanted a show. What he had created was something else entirely. As night began to gather in the forest, the enslaved man melted back into shadow, leaving behind confusion, wounded men, and a hunt that no longer knew which direction it was facing. The game had broken its frame, and everyone involved felt it. Night did not fall all at once. It crept in slowly, as if the forest itself were deciding how much darkness the men deserved. The last light drained from the sky in narrow bands, leaving the ravine and the upper ridges drowned in shadow, while the canopy above still held a faint gray glow. This was the hour the enslaved man trusted most. Men lost certainty here. Shapes lied. Sounds traveled wrong. The hunters regrouped poorly. They gathered where the ground widened enough for horses to stand without slipping, lanterns raised, faces slick with sweat and rainwater. Their numbers were thinner now. Too many riders were missing. Too many dogs refused commands, huddled close to handlers, or fled outright. No one laughed anymore. No one spoke of sport. The governor stood among them, coat streaked with mud, boots ruined, his composure cracking at the edges. He had dismounted without remembering when. His horse stood unattended, head low, sides heaving. The governor stared into the trees as if willing them to part and return what he believed was owed to him. "He's still just a slave," the governor said aloud, voice sharp. He needed to hear the words. "He bleeds like anyone else." No one answered immediately. A handler finally spoke, hesitant. "Sir, he stopped running." That landed differently. Stopped running meant intention. It meant choice. It meant the hunted had decided where the next moment would happen. The governor felt something cold twist in his stomach, something he had not felt in years, not fear exactly. Recognition. Orders followed anyway, because power did not know what else to do. The men were split into smaller groups, instructed to sweep outward, lanterns low, guns ready. The governor insisted on being in the central group, refusing to retreat. Retreat would mean admitting the loss of narrative. He would not allow that. The enslaved man watched them from above. He had climbed to a rocky shelf overlooking a narrow approach where the forest funneled movement naturally. He could hear them before he saw them, boots scuffing, stone murmured curses, the metallic click of a gun being checked too often. Lantern light bobbed unevenly, casting shadows that stretched and collapsed like breathing things. He pressed his back against cold rock and listened. His breath was steady despite the pounding in his chest. Pain flared dully in his shoulder, where the bullet had grazed him. His palms burned where skin had torn earlier. He welcomed it all. Pain kept him present. He was done retreating. When the first lantern rounded the bend below, he shifted his weight carefully and dislodged a stone the size of his head. It tumbled silently at first, then struck rock and gathered speed. The sound exploded suddenly, violent and unexpected. The stone smashed into the leading man's chest, knocking him backward into the one behind him. Both went down hard, lantern shattering, flame hissing out in the damp. Shouts erupted instantly. Guns were raised, firing blindly into darkness. Muzzle flashes lit the rock face in brief, blinding bursts. The enslaved man moved immediately, not waiting to see results. He slid sideways along the ledge, then dropped to a lower shelf and vanished into brush. He heard screams, one high and panicked, another deep and furious. He did not slow. Below, confusion spread fast. Men shouted conflicting directions. One fired again, the shot echoing wildly. Someone tripped over a fallen body, another dropped his lantern, plunging half the group into near-total darkness. "This way!" Someone yelled. "No, back!" Another shouted. The enslaved man circled them now, using elevation and shadow. He could smell them sweat, fear, powder. He could feel their panic tartaning the air. He found another place where the ground narrowed between two trees with exposed roots twisted like ribs. He wedged a heavy branch into place, angled just enough to catch a knee. He covered it lightly with leaves, then moved off again, breathing slow. The governor reached the edge of the chaos moments later, lantern raised high, face flushed with anger. "Enough," he shouted. "You were letting him herd you like animals." A shot rang out too close, and the governor flinched, despite himself. He hated that. He hated how the night had stripped him of certainty. A man ran past him suddenly, eyes wide, face bloodied. "He is everywhere," the man babbled. "He came down on us from the rocks." The governor grabbed the man by the collar and shoved him back. "Get control of yourself," he snapped. It's one man. But his grip lingered a moment too long, fingers tight with something close to desperation. The enslaved man watched this exchange from behind a tree, close enough to see the whites of their eyes. He felt a strange clarity settle over him. This was no longer escape, this was reckoning. He waited until the group moved again, funneling along the narrow path he had prepared. The first man stepped squarely onto the concealed branch. Bone cracked loud and final. The man screamed and went down, clutching his leg, weapon skidding away. Panic detonated. Men surged backward, colliding, tripping over each other. Someone fired again, the shot punching uselessly into dirt. The enslaved man charged then, roaring not in rage, but in declaration. The sound tore through the trees, raw and human and terrifying. It was the sound of a man who had stopped asking permission to exist. He slammed into the nearest hunter, driving him to the ground with crushing force. Close enough to singe leaves near his head, he ducked instinctively and rolled behind a fallen log, breath hard now, heart hammering, bark splintered under bullets. Wood dust filled the air. "Hold your fire," the governor shouted. "I'll hit each other." But discipline was gone. Fear had eaten it. The enslaved man waited for the shots to stop, then burst from cover in a different direction, entirely vanishing into darkness. He heard curses and frantic footsteps following the wrong path. He circled again, deeper into shadow, moving like water around stone. The governor realized too late that he had lost command of the hunt entirely. His men were reacting, not acting. The terrain dictated movement now. The night dictated vision. And somewhere out there, the man he had intended to humiliate was shaping the field. Rage surged through him, hot and reckless. He drew his pistol and marched forward himself, ignoring shouted warnings. "You," he yelled into the trees. "You think this changes anything? You are still mine." The enslaved man heard the voice clearly. He recognized it. He slowed, turned, followed the sound carefully, placing each foot with intent. The Governor Heir's voice cut through the dark, arrogant even now, thick with entitlement. Lantern light bobbed unevenly ahead, illuminating the governor, his figure coat torn, face streaked with sweat, pistol shaking just slightly in his hand. The enslaved man approached from behind, silent. He stepped onto a patch of loose gravel, and it shifted with a soft scrape. The governor spun, pistol raised, eyes wide. For a heartbeat, they faced each other. Up close, the governor looked smaller, not physically, but in presence. His authority clung to him like a costume that no longer fit. His mouth opened, searching for a command that would still work. "You," he said, voice cracking with disbelief and fury. "Do you know who I am?" The enslaved man did not answer. He stepped forward instead. The governor fired. The shot went wide, a recoil jerking his arm upward. Before he could recover, the enslaved man closed the distance and struck the governor, his wrist hard with the edge of his hand. The pistol flew free, clattering into the dark. The governor staggered back, tripping, landing hard on his side. He scrambled, trying to rise, panic finally tearing through his composure. "Stop," he gasped. "Stop, listen to me." The enslaved man loomed over him, chest heaving, breath loud in the night. He felt every muscle in his body alive, coiled, ready. The governor looked up at him, and in that moment the roles were unmistakable. "Think," the governor pleaded, voice high. "You don't have to do this. I can fix this. I can give you." The enslaved man grabbed him by the front of his coat and hauled him upright with terrifying ease. He slammed the governor back against a tree, bark biting into flesh. The governor cried out, choking. "You hunted me," the enslaved man said finally, voice low and steady. "For fun." The governor shook his head frantically. "It was just a game." The enslaved man's grip tightened. "I don't play games." He drove his forearm into the governor's chest, knocking the breath from him, then struck again and again. Each blow was precise, controlled, delivered without haste, not rage, judgment. The governor sagged, barely conscious, sliding down the tree. The enslaved man stepped back, watching him collapse into the leaves, gasping, helpless. Shouts echoed, nearby men closing in, lanterns approaching fast. The enslaved man looked once more at the governor, then turned away. He did not linger. Ending the hunt did not require spectacle. It required survival. He vanished into the forest again, leaving behind a governor broken in body and in myth, and a group of men who would never speak of this night without lowering their voices. By the time the others reached the tree, the enslaved man was gone, and the hunt was over. The governor did not wake immediately. When he did, the world came back to him in pieces, cold first, then pain, then sound. His chest burned with every breath. His wrist throbbed, useless and swollen. Leaves clung to his coat, damp and crushed, and when he tried to move, a sharp ache lanced through his side and stole the air from his lungs. For a moment he did not know where he was. For a moment he thought he had fallen from a horse. Then memory returned, and with it humiliation. Lantern light swam into focus above him. Faces hovered, pale, shaken, streaked with mud and sweat. Men who only hours earlier had laughed at wages and sport now looked like survivors of something they could not explain. Someone knelt beside him and touched his shoulder too carefully, as if afraid he might shatter. "Sir," a voice said, unsure, "you were alive." The governor swallowed hard. Alive, the word felt inadequate. His mouth tasted of dirt and blood. He forced himself upright with help, groaning despite himself. The sound disgusted him. He had never groaned in front of subordinates before. "Where is he?" he rasped. No one answered immediately. "He ran," someone said finally. "We lost him, the forest." Silence. The governor snapped, though the effort sent another wave of pain through him. "Don't speak excuses to me." But excuses were all they had left. They helped him back toward the edge of the woods where horses waited, restless and spooked. The ride back was slow, humiliating. Every jolt sent fire through his ribs. The night pressed in around them, no longer dramatic, just heavy and indifferent. The forest did not chase them. It did not need to. It had already won. By the time they reached the estate, dawn was threatening the horizon with pale, unforgiving light. The lawn that had hosted laughter and drink now stood empty, trampled, stained. Broken glass glittered in the grass. A chair lay overturned, its legs snapped. Servants moved quietly, eyes down, cleaning without being told. They did not ask questions. They did not need answers. The governor was carried inside. Word spread quickly, despite efforts to contain it. Men were missing. Others were wounded. Horses had been lost. Dogs refused to eat. The hunt, meant to be a display of absolute control, had collapsed into chaos, injury, and shame. By midday, messengers were dispatched with carefully chosen language: an incident, a disturbance, an unfortunate accident during a demonstration of discipline. No one used the word hunt anymore. The governor lay in bed, feverish, staring at the ceiling as servants came and went. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face above him in the dark, calm, unafraid, resolute, not pleading, not raging. Judging, that was the worst part. The man had not begged for mercy. He had not needed it. The governor tried to reclaim control the only way he knew how, through punishment. Orders were barked from his bed. Overseers were whipped for incompetence. Handlers were blamed for weak dogs. Riders were fined, demoted, threatened. Someone had to pay for the story slipping out of his hands. But fear had already moved faster than orders. In the slave quarters, whispers spread like roots underground. They did not have details. They did not need them. What mattered was simple and dangerous. A man had been hunted for sport, and the hunt had failed. A governor had bled. Men with guns had run. That knowledge settled into bodies quietly. Shoulders straightened a fraction. Eyes lifted when they thought no one was watching. Silence carried new weight. The man himself moved far from the estate before the sun rose fully. He did not stop until his lungs burned and his legs trembled. When he finally slowed, it was not from fear of pursuit, but from the understanding that he had crossed another threshold. Going back anywhere familiar was no longer possible. He washed in a stream, scrubbing blood and mud from his skin until the water ran dark and then clear again. He drank deeply, letting the cold steady him. His body shook, not with terror, but with the aftershock of release. What had been held tight inside him for years had finally been spent. He did not feel triumph. He felt clarity. The forest thinned as he moved on, giving way to rough hills and stone. He avoided roads instinctively. Roads led to men who asked questions and wrote things down. He followed animal paths instead, trusting hunger and instinct. By nightfall, he reached higher ground where the wind carried scent away and sound traveled differently. There, he rested for the first time without chains in his mind. Sleep came hard and heavy. Dreams rose fields, dogs, laughter, but they broke apart before taking shape. He woke before dawn, alert, listening. Nothing followed him. No horns, no shouts. No baying. The governor never sent another hunt after him. Officially, the story ended as an injury, an illness, a failure of underlings. Records were altered. Names were omitted. The governor resumed his duties months later, thinner, quieter, his authority intact on paper, if not in spirit. He never hosted another spectacle like that again. But the land remembered. Travelers avoided certain paths now. Hunters spoke of places where sound died strangely and animals refused to go. Men laughed when they told these stories, but they did not go looking to prove them false. And among the enslaved something endured. Not hope. Hope was dangerous, but knowledge. That power could stumble. That flesh could refuse its assigned meaning. That a body built for labor could become a weapon when pushed too far. The man did not become a legend in his lifetime. Legends required witnesses, and witnesses were liabilities. Instead, he became absence. A gap in the governor. As account books. A missing body that never turned up. A question no one asked too loudly. He moved on, changing routes, changing companies, sometimes alone, sometimes not. He learned which lands were safer, which people listened, which silences could be trusted. He carried scars that pulled when the weather changed and memories that sharpened his instincts. What he had done did not end anything. It was not meant to. It was a reminder, and reminders, once planted, had a way of growing long after the men who tried to erase them were gone. Years passed without ceremony. Time did what it always did, softened edges, buried tracks, dulled the sharpest retellings, but it did not erase what mattered. The governor's estate continued to function, its fields still cut by bent backs and measured seasons, its ledgers still inked with numbers that pretended to be order. On paper, nothing had changed. On the ground, everything had. The governor himself returned to the rhythms of office with a smaller presence. He spoke less in company. He rode less often. When he did ride, he stayed to open ground and daylight, avoiding woods with a care he pretended was prudence. He flinched at sudden sounds. He dismissed it as age. Others noticed and did not comment. Commenting was dangerous. No proclamation ever addressed the hunt. No apology. No reckoning. The men who had been injured were compensated quietly. The families of those who did not return received nothing but warnings to keep quiet. Silence was enforced, not by law alone, but by fear of becoming a problem that required solving. Yet silence is porous. In the quarters, in kitchens, in fields where songs were sung low enough to be mistaken for breath, the story lived. It changed shape with each telling, not growing larger but sharper. The man was described differently, each time bigger, slower, calmer, quieter, but the center held. He had been chosen as sport. He had refused the script. He had stood his ground, and he had walked away. Children learned the lesson without being taught it outright. They watched the way older men paused at the edge of certain woods. They noticed how overseers avoided particular paths after dark. They felt the difference in the air when someone mentioned the governor's name and then let it fall. Knowledge like that did not announce itself. It settled. The man who had been hunted did not become a leader with followers at his back. He did not seek an audience or carve a territory. Those were the ambitions of men who needed to be seen. He needed the opposite. He moved as necessity demanded, sometimes alone, sometimes among others who ran when running was the only answer. He learned the margins of places, the soft borders where law thinned and rumor grew teeth. He learned to read people the way he read land. He knew who asked questions to help and who asked them to measure. He knew which smiles were invitations and which were nets. He learned to sleep lightly and wake ready. He learned that freedom was not a destination but a practice. When he stayed among others, he worked. He shared what he knew when it was asked for, never offering more than could be carried safely. He showed how to move without noise, how to wait without panic, how to use the body not as a burden but as leverage. He never spoke of the governor unless pressed. When he did, he spoke without heat. "They think power is loud," he said once to a man younger than him, eyes bright with dangerous hunger. "That's how it survives. Loud things draw attention. Attention draws force. Force draws graves. Done to be loud." The younger man listened, or he did not. Not everyone survived long enough to learn. The years made the man's body change. The weight that had once been forced onto him shifted and hardened into something trimmer, more efficient. Scars remained on his wrists, his shoulder, his hands, but they became part of the map he carried within himself. When storms came, they pulled and burned. He took that as weather. Way of reminding him where he had been. Sometimes, at night, when the land was quiet and the wind spoke plainly, he felt the old presence return, not voices, not visions, but a steady pressure behind the eyes and chest. The sense that he was not alone in his walking. He did not name it. Names had a way of making things smaller. He accepted it the way one accepted gravity. The governor died eventually, as men like him always did, surrounded by property, attended by servants who had learned to keep their faces smooth. The death was announced properly. Bells rang. Papers were stamped. A successor took the chair and promised continuity. Continuity was another word for forgetting, but forgetting never worked the way it was supposed to. A few months after the burial, a group of traders refused a route that cut too close to the old forest. They cited weather. They cited cost. They cited superstition with a laugh that did not reach their eyes. They took longer paths and lost money. They told themselves it was temporary. Others followed suit. The forest did not change. It did not need to. Men did that work themselves. In the end, the man understood something the governor never had, that power depended on agreement, on stories people accepted because the alternative was too dangerous to imagine. Once a story cracked, it never quite sealed again. He never returned to the estate. He never needed to. The place lived inside him already, reduced to a set of lessons he carried forward. When he finally grew old enough that speed mattered less than judgment, he settled farther out, near land that did not belong to anyone who mattered on paper. He worked when he chose. He rested when he needed to. He watched seasons come and go without counting them. When death came for him, it did not come loudly. There were no horns, no dogs, no audience. It came the way it should, quiet, earned, unremarkable to anyone who had not learned to look closely.